Hello, my name's Andrew Smith. They call me a teacher, preacher, and sober preacher. I teach at Tennessee Tech in Cookeville, Tennessee. I'm a pastor of a nearby church, but I'm also a kind of a journalist, poet, uh, media person, just kind of putting stuff out there and putting it out there today as Ordinary Space, a little fanzine started a couple years ago with my buddy Rick Quinn. And we're excited today to interview and talk with Calvin and Nelia Kimbrough, who I've known for about 6 years. And they are retired pastors from the United Methodist tradition, but they spent a lot of time in Cookeville. They're both from Tennessee, unlike me, I'm from Michigan, but they spent a lot of time in Cookeville, where I live, at Tennessee Tech. I came to Tennessee Tech in 2001, right around the time of September 11th, and right around the war fervor building up to the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And during those early years of the 21st century, it was like the drumbeat for war was beating loudly in this very rural, very Republican area that I live. And I kind of come from the hippie side of things, and from Detroit. My parents were kind of progressive or liberal or radical Christians, and so the church to me and Jesus always spoke of hippie things. And when I met Calvin and Nelia, one of our first conversations tipped me off to that they knew a lot about something that I cared about deeply, which was that Jesus was a hippie and that the church was filled with people who were for peace and for human rights and for respecting and honoring earth or creation. And so they did all this in Cookeville, this town, this conservative college town where I live and work. And I really couldn't believe it, except they had pictures to prove it. And so I learned over several years of friendship and several months of interviews that was in a book or a manuscript, I guess you could say, that I wrote called Banjo Bread, which is sort of a biography of them. But it's really kind of more like a theological manifesto about the meaning of the 60s and the meaning of peace and justice as it relates to counterculture, which is music and poetry, as it relates, and art, as it relates to Jesus, and as it relates to the world being a more peaceful and just place. So that's kind of a summary, a little bit roundabout. But today we want to talk about May 1970. We want to talk about the spring of 1970, because that was a time when the 60s were over and the war in Vietnam was escalating. And exactly 50 years ago, and we're going to release this video on May 4th, 2020. It's a Monday. So exactly 50 years ago today, there was a very intense radical protest on the college campus of Kent State in Ohio, and National Guard opened fire, and 4 people died on that day. And there was a saying that the protesters had, which was "bring the war home." And what they meant was they were ready to kind of fight the man in the streets. They weren't sure that peace was even going to be achieved through peaceful means. But I don't think they anticipated that college kids were going to be murdered in their pursuit of peace, no matter how wild and crazy those protests were. And so we're in Cookeville at the time. I'm a baby up in having just moved to Ohio from Illinois. And these are young 20-something college students. They're very involved in church. They're getting their master's degree in history. They're studying civil rights and everything that's going on at the time. And you're hearing about this stuff on the television news and in the newspapers. So why don't you first just kind of give us the general vibe, as you've done for me in previous interviews we've done, about the vibes at Tennessee Tech during the very late 60s and the early 70s, especially related to young people like yourselves representing the hippie style, but also views on the war in Vietnam, and just kind of like the vibe in Cookeville today compared to the vibe here in Tennessee and all over the United States 50 years later. And I will say this, and hopefully I'll do less talking as the conversation goes forward, but we just passed in recent days more United States deaths from the COVID-19 coronavirus in just a couple of months than from the entire casualties of U.S. Soldiers in Vietnam. So we're in a different time, a different place. War is against a disease, and what does that even mean? But here we are, and we're still dreaming about peace. I see Nelia's got her peace sign scarf on. So we're John, what did John Lennon say? You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. We still want peace. And so welcome to from that. I'm in Cookeville this afternoon, and they're speaking to me. We're pre-recording this, and they're in Nashville, Tennessee. So welcome to Calvin Kimbrough and Nelia, the Reverend Calvin and Reverend Nelia Kimbrough, to talk about May 1970 and anything else that we might discuss. Welcome to whatever this is we're doing, Ordinary Space on the YouTube.
So I'll start, and I want to go way back to the 5th grade. And I grew up in Lawrence, Tennessee, small conservative town. Calvin grew up in Nashville. But in the 5th grade, we both woke up to the morning that the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And that was a huge crisis everywhere. And when that morning, and what happened at that point from then on was that we were told that it was our job to get a good education and to figure out how we could technologically beat the Soviets. So that's kind of the frame of reference that we grew up in. We both ended up at Tennessee Tech, a very small conservative school, and we eventually found our way to the Wesley Foundation, which was an amazing breadth of contemporary and progressive worship and study and liturgy and activism experience. It was there, though, that we became involved with a group of folks who also were drawn to the Wesley Foundation. And we came from many different political viewpoints. But somehow during that time, we were able to love one another, work with one another, worship with one another, and yet share very different views on especially the war. And so that was part of the context out of which we existed. One time, especially that we've talked about before and that you cited in your writings, is that we had a coffee house at the Wesley Foundation. And it was a very different time than Tennessee Tech and Cookeville were at the end of nowhere. And people didn't have cars and everybody stayed on campus. So they would come to a coffee house on a Friday night. And one night, a friend brought in an American flag. And on that flag, he had penned pictures and words and depictions of the horrific things that were being done in the world in the name of the United States. And of course, protesting the war. So that was hung, and people began to react to that. So it was not only those of us who opposed the war, but also folks who were in the ROTC program, who were going to be leaving very soon and going off to the war that we were opposing, and some of them would not come back. But we were all able to stay in that room. We were all able to talk about it, and nobody flew out in anger, nobody got punched out. We all sat there and listened. And later on, it wasn't quite that easy to share conflicting views, but that night it worked, and we all sat there with one another in a community to talk about what was happening in our country.
Sorry.
We lost you for a second, but it's okay. We'll just consider that to be part of the humanity of all this. So you had just finished telling the story about the flag at the Wesley Foundation, and you've told that story so many times, and I've heard it at least a couple of times, and the young people at the Wesley today, they talk about hearing that story from you. But what we were saying is that we didn't have cable television. We didn't have this kind of, extreme polarization that we talk about now. And we didn't have Twitter. So there wasn't this kind of, rhetorical shouting all the time, and maybe some of the name calling personal attacks that we seem to make on people from ideological sort of disagreements. But yet again, those friendships transcended those differences, but the differences were starting to come out when you heard stuff, that that the protesters were bums, and some of the stereotypes were starting to come out, that we even to this day have, in the so-called culture wars, is these stereotypes. And how did you all lean into, because you found your way to be very convicted about peace and justice and your faith, and you also were very creative types, and so you were finding your way into the folk music and the rock music and the art and the poetry, of the time. So how did that feel in Cookeville to sort of find your way to being hip? I mean, that was the first thing I figured out when I met you, and you showed me all those old pictures, was how much different it was to the crew cuts and to the kind of, even the early pictures you had of you guys when you first met, and you were still kind of a little bit preppy yourself, Nelia, to like the pictures from like a couple of years later. I can see both of you just sort of finding yourselves through fashion, among other things. So what was it like becoming kind of, hip and committed to peace at the same time?
We didn't. So we didn't have all of the social media, but we had the evening news and we had newspapers. But the other thing we had was that we had professors and we had campus ministers who were committed to showing us a broader understanding of the world. Dr. B.F. Jones was our major professor, and the way he taught was that he taught that history was not about dates and wars and who was president when. It was about the whole understanding of human interaction. And so you would go to class, and the topics he would talk about and lecture about could be everywhere from the education department at Tennessee Tech to what's happening in the war, to what was happening with the Civil War. So it covered everything. And so your whole manner of thinking was challenged. And for those of us who were open to it, it just felt like there was more and more we were learning about what it meant to be a citizen of the world, and what it meant to be a human being, and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus.
So one of the things that I think was so important was that at the Wesley Foundation, the campus minister was Bob Lewis. And we also had Marge Hargrove, who was on the staff. And they were constantly committed to helping us broaden our understanding of the world. And just to give you an example about that, so on May the 4th, this event happened at Kent State, and of course, it electrified everybody. And then we moved into planning a candlelight vigil at Tennessee Tech, which was a very interesting affair, and which Bob helped us maneuver. And we ended up having a very interesting meeting in Derryberry Hall, where the president, Derryberry, was in his office, and we were in a conference room next door. And hustling between us was Donald Kepliner, who at that point was the dean for the School of Arts and Sciences, but he was also on the board at the Wesley Foundation. So we eventually planned this small candlelight vigil on the front steps at Derryberry Hall, which we did that evening, and it was very small, but it happened. But then the next Sunday at the Wesley Foundation, we did a service built completely around what had happened at Kent State, and the service at that point in time, we were doing worship on Sundays at midnight on Saturday night, Sunday morning, and at 10:15 a.m. And so the service happened twice, at midnight and at 10:15 a.m. And just to give you an example, Nelia's going to read here from the the bulletin for that worship service and the preparation for worship, which asked everybody to think on the following. And this is an excerpt from that piece.
We hear you, O man, in agony cry. For freedom you march, in riots you die. Your face in the papers we read and see, the tree must be planted by human decree. For a nation to be but that conflict is going on, marked on the one side by campus violence and destruction, and now on the other by the shooting of the students at Kent State, where 4 died and 11 were injured. On the day after he ordered troops into Cambodia, President Nixon spoke of some campus radicals who oppose his Vietnam policies as bums who were out blowing up campuses, while the soldiers out there doing their duty were the greatest. That sort of statement is designed to declare the war good and the campus opposition to the war bad. The issue is not so simple. Labels cannot be posted on people or events with such ease.
So, and then Bob Lewis's sermon that Sunday was misplaced anger, and and we did, a service that was completely built around the events that had happened that week. So, and what Nelia described as being a place where a lot of different kinds of people were gathered. They were gathered that Sunday morning. I mean, it was really a campus worship service. There were families that came and professors who came and students. So it was just a very interesting time to be at Tennessee Tech and to be a part of the activities there.
One of the things that I think is that this service exemplifies is that in all of the events that were happening, and of course there were so many, we started in 1964 and we finished our second degree there in 71. So many things happened in that time span. But always at the Wesley Foundation, there was some kind of gathering up of these events into the experience of worship. So with Kent State, yes, there was the candlelight vigil on the steps, but it was the worship service that then brought forth both the tragedy and the healing of that event. And that happened time and time again there, that it was through the experience of worship that we grounded what was happening about with us, and that we brought to it the new light of liberation from the gospel and from the teachings of Jesus. And we were able to do that in very contemporary forms. So one of the things that happened in that service was that Calvin sang a song by Pete Seeger entitled Letter to Eve, which was very, very poignant song for that particular event and for that particular time. But I'm really grateful, and I think that's probably, well, I've always loved worship, but that experience at the Wesley Foundation of everything being gathered up into the experience of worship really deepened my understanding of what worship is about and why we are called into worship as a regular part of our discipleship.
Liturgy is not just song and word, but it's a form of action because of the combination of word and song and the physical interactive presence of worship. It becomes a kind of, bodily sacrament for us to be in that moment. And it seems to me with memorial services today and people having to be, have memorial services on Zoom and things like this because of the coronavirus, it seems to me that we're really reminded of the fragility and really the risk involved in worship. People have talked about, maybe we're quote unquote afraid because we worship at home today and not in the building due to the safety restrictions that we're experiencing. in a way, it seems to me all the more bold that we're experiencing still this intimacy and this interactiveness through these strange, meetings. Like, I mean, this video is going to have some blips and some kind of gaps due to the technology. It seems our the fluency of the Wi-Fi here is 1 minute it's vivid, and next minute your voice is cracking up a little bit. But I just want to say that I want to ask a little bit about the midnight worship and the inclusion of pop culture and poetry and folk music, contemporary folk music in the worship. Because I think today, I think we have a very watered down idea of what so-called contemporary worship is. Because today I think of a Saturday service says to me, it's a mega church with like thousands of, members. I think a Saturday worship service today is like, to me says like Walmart staying open 24/7. It's just it's religion as, as for the consumer, we have to have a Saturday worship because we have so many people. We can't fit them all in the building on Sunday morning. We have to have Saturday worship because they work on Sunday and they're serving, capitalism or whatever as wage slaves on Sunday. But to think about a midnight worship service then in a college campus, to me, it seems incredibly avant-garde and weird. Like, why would you have midnight church, and that you would incorporate all these elements. And the fact that you're saying that a lot of the people there were professors and townspeople and ROTC members, it wasn't just this little, hippie enclave doing that, though there might have been an element of the avant-garde through Marge and Bob and you guys. It just seems amazing to me. Like, what was it like? Were you in the arena that night at Wesley? Who came? Was it candlelight? I'm talking about the worship now, midnight worship in May of 1970. Maybe set the vibe for what those services were like, and then maybe Calvin can share that song, and hopefully the computers will and your phone, your smartphone will cooperate, and we won't lose our signal. I almost lost you guys there for a minute. I got scared, but maybe create the vibe of that Saturday night for us.
Well, I suppose, I mean, it's awful difficult sometimes to remember, after 50 years, but I suppose one part of that was having a service at a time when people who are not going to get up on Sunday morning could come to worship. And in this bulletin, what we have is that at those 12 midnight services, we had communion instead of a sermon. And so there was communion that night at the midnight service. The Wesley Foundation was just a place where many different kinds of things happened, and we had lots of people that came in to visit. We had poets and songwriters and a hymn writer from New York who were friends of Marge come down several times to do programs. It was just a great place to be. So anyway, we didn't have a lot of candles. I don't remember. I mean, we had candles in Chianti bottles, with the wax drip down the side in the coffee house, but I don't think we had anything like that in the worship center.
We had the candles on the worship table, but I think that was it. We had some specially made candle sticks for the worship table, and we had candles there. So
and the worship services were both in the arena,
right
there at the Wesley Foundation. It was built then. Actually, it had been built the year before, or maybe 2 years before. I don't remember, but it was brand new.
So doing worship, at sometimes at campus centers, you don't have worship as a part of the campus life, the campus ministry life. But we did at Tennessee Tech, and Bob had, because of his relationships at the campus, but also in the town, was able to offer worship there at the campus without being a threat to the other congregations in the town. And so, and Bob is one of those amazing people who just attracts creative people, and then he says to them, live out your creativity. So he says to Marge Hargrove, have drama on the campus, show foreign films, teach students how to speak in public, do all of those things she was so good at. And then he was able to listen to folks like Calvin and myself. And we said, well, we want to do some different kinds of things in worship. And he would allow us to do that. The other thing about Bob was that when things went well and they would say, wow, that was a great idea, that went so well, Bob would say, oh, well, that was because of Marge, or that was because of so-and-so. And when things didn't go well, he would say, well, that was my responsibility. I'm the one, I'll take responsibility for that. So that provided a whole protected space where creative worship could happen. Also in that time, there was lots of creativity going on in the larger university world in terms of worship. So Motive Magazine, conferences, people were trying all kinds of things in worship, and the bounds of what worship was really being pushed out and broadened. And we were able to do that as well at Tennessee Tech. As Calvin said, that midnight worship was for people who wouldn't come on Sunday morning. And it was great. I mean, people came to midnight worship who would never have darkened the door for a Sunday morning service. And we had a lot of jazz musicians who would work with us. And that was just a real freeing kind of time, and helped to think about what was worship really. Was it a certain order that was kind of an orthodox order that we'd grown up with? Or was it more of the Spirit breaking into what is happening and enlivening what is going on in the everyday world and bringing that together in the context of a worship experience?
Yes, I realize now that you said Bob was and Marge, they were always bringing these guests, and that you had already had the guy from New York, the playwright. I'm saying not Al Carmine's had already come and done his whole bohemian happening thing, and then Calvin, it was 3 years earlier that you had been to Cleveland Week, and this thing was like the most bohemian, over the top thing I've ever heard of ever. To this day, even when I go back, because after hearing from you, I went and found some secondary sources from the New Left side. So what Calvin and Nelia and this Motive Magazine were part of these, they called them youth movements, but it would be like the Baptist youth movement, the Methodist student movement, these youth movements that were affiliated with the denominations by the late 60s interacted with the New Left. And so they interacted with the peace movement and civil rights and feminism and all the artsy stuff. And this was out there for the church, but it was also out there for the New Left, because like today, there was, I think, the stigma in some people's mind that the political ones were very hard. They were reading theory, and they were coming out of, traditional socialist, frameworks where it was very secular and very, much about the working class. And you were bringing all of this Jesus stuff into this space, and then throw the whole hippie kind of, throw the macrame of hippiness all over, just wrap it up in bell bottoms and macrame. And it's utterly mind blowing. So was it a lament, do you think, when you sang that song that night? Were you mourning, and were you scared yourself? I mean, as young people seeing that, what happened at Ohio on that campus and giving this worship, was it a kind of lament? Was it a cry? Was it a wail? Was it a howl? What was that?
Well, before Calvin sings, and I think you'll catch the flavor of that in the song, I just want to say is that we had done marches, we'd gone to marches, we protested, all of that. But what is so different about Kent State is then they started killing us. And that was really a shock. That was a real wake up, because prior to that time, I think folks on campus had kind of had a kind of protected bubble around, because we could protest and we could shut things down, and we could be in the streets, but then we can get up and go to class the next day. but these students didn't go to class the next day. They were gunned down. And that was really a shock. So for me, this is about the shock of being killed. And of course, that's only continued. And so now we've gone through these horrific times of persons of color just being gunned down. And now we're experiencing this huge wave of death that's sweeping across the world. So that was like that was like a coming of age moment. That was like, wake up. This is really, really serious.
I'm afraid I might forget, and I almost forgot, and I just looked it up. Right, and I don't think it's in the manuscript that I wrote about your story. Which I'm going to make some of that text available to people who also watch this video. But the four individuals were 19 and 20 years old. It was Jeff Miller was 20 years old, Allison Krauss, 19 years old, Will Schroeder was 19 years old, and Sandra Scheuer, 20 years old. And I had actually told you, Calvin, I don't know if you remember, a couple months ago, I had bought tickets to see a band I follow in Toledo on Monday night, and I was going to drive up on Sunday and get a room, and I was going to go, and they were going to have memorials all weekend long. I'm sure they've been postponed or downsized. I might look up and see if there's going to be a video memorial I can go to online. But they were going to have memorials all this weekend, and I just think it's important, that we tell these stories, and I'm so grateful that you're willing to keep telling the story, because, ever since I've been meeting you all 6 years ago, I've prompted you to have the same conversation over and over again, because it nurtures and nourishes me in such a way to be reminded, because I feel that I'm in your lineage, and the work is still yet to be done on the campus here to continue to educate and to inspire. So, Calvin, I'm really itchy for you to put us in. I just can't imagine what was it like just to get up that night. But you've done it before. You've kind of painted the picture of the vibe of the night and the midnight worship services. But what was it like for you to sing in those spaces? You've done it at some conferences. Maybe you did it up at Beersheba Springs, up at that mountaintop. I know you told me about a crazy, wild thing, worship weekend y'all did up there. But what was it like just that night to get up and just to let this? I mean, this is such a powerful song, and tell us a little bit about this particular song and what it was like to convey grief and lament and protest in this way.
Well, I had started learning the song because Pete Seeger wrote it in 1967 about the war in Vietnam. And so the song was really written about the war. And it has a chorus, and the chorus has the words Pacem and Terris in it, which means, as Pete said, it's Latin as the Italians would pronounce it, saying peace on earth, and Mir, which is Russian for peace, and Shanti, which is Hindu for peace, and Salam, which is Muslim for peace, and then Haywa is the last little phrase in the chorus part, which Pete Seeger said was the Japanese pronunciation of the two Chinese characters, peace in the world. Anyway, so the song, though, just has these verses that were so perfect for that week, and it just it was amazing to have a chance to sing this song in relationship to the events that had happened in the week. And for me, it seemed like it was the very best thing that I could do. I mean, it was the best offering that I could bring. So the song is called Letter to Eve, and you can find online recordings of Pete Seeger actually singing the song. It goes like this. Oh, Eve, Where is Adam? Now you're kicked out of the garden. Oh, Eve, where is Adam? Now you're picked out of the garden. In a wandering from shore to shore, now you find there's no more. Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Don't you wish love, only love, could save this world from disaster? Love, only love, could save this world from disaster. Don't you wish love could end this confusion? Or is it just one more illusion? Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Well, if you want to have great love, you've got to have great anger. If you want to have great love, you've got to have great anger. When I see innocent folks shot down, you want me to just hang my head and frown? Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. But if you want to hit the target square, you better not have blind anger. If you want to hit the target square, you better not have blind anger. Or else it will be just one more time. The correction created another crime. Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Eve, Eve, you tell Adam next time he asks you. Eve, you tell Adam next time he asks you. He'll say, baby, it's cold outside. What's the password to come inside? And you'll say, oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Eve, Eve, you tell Adam we got to build a new garden. Eve, you tell Adam we got to build a new garden. We got to get working on the building of a decent for all God's children. No, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Well, if music could only bring peace, I'd only be a musician. Yeah, if music could only bring peace, I'd only be a musician. If songs could do more than dull the pain, if melodies could only break these chains, oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa. 4,000 languages in this world means the same thing to every boy and girl. Oh, Pakshamin Teri Samir Shanti Salam Hiwa.
Thank you.
Yes.
I hope, Nelia, you can come back now. Amen. And did you ever imagine in your late teens and early 20s that we'd still be having to work so hard on the same things? Don't you feel like we're just having to do a do-over over and over again? And now, of course, climate change, has become maybe one of the big things we're worried about. But that was something you all were telling us about in 1970. I mean, that was the first Earth Day. And I mean, all the stuff, it's the same stuff, and gender and racism. We're just working on all the same stuff. While we're still in our time machine back from 70 to 2020, what are we forgetting to do? Maybe somebody younger than both. I'm 50 in my 50s. Y'all are too old for me to say how old you are on the radio or the TV or whatever this is. What can we tell the 20-year-old of today at Tennessee Tech or at any college or not in college and working in the fast food, risking their lives to bring food to people during COVID-19? What can't we figure out? I mean, what's the lesson here going away? We're almost done, by the way, and thank you so much for your time today. What's the takeaway? Can we go? What did Pete Seeger say? We got to go build a new garden. I mean, is that it? Do we have to start over again? What's the thing?
Well, one of the things that I would say is that we seem to have a pretty clear idea of what it means and what it means for us to have personal freedom. It just seems like we have such a hard time wrapping our minds around the common good. And that's how I would describe this. And in our, I don't know how to say something about the huge picture, but it does seem like in my time of living that we've learned an awful lot more and put a lot more stock in our personal freedom and a lot less stock in how we create the common good. I don't know what to say about that.
As I think about that time and this time, I think there was a naive thought that we were going to solve all these things. And we did make a lot of progress, especially in terms of legislation to support the civil rights. And we did end the Vietnam War. But I think that we underestimated the nature of evil and that it continues to exist. And I think what it means for me is that every generation has to do its work. We did our work, but every generation following us has to do the work, and this generation has to do the work too. And it's a huge work now. And one of the things that this pandemic is teaching us is that the work we have to do is work that involves the whole world. It isn't just one segment. It isn't just one country. It is all of us. It is all of creation that we must now work on the behalf of. And as Calvin talks about the common good, we must figure out how to support the common good everywhere in this creation.
So I'm watching the TV, as I'm sure you all are too, and I'm seeing the comedians are the prophets of our age. And I watched a lot of Trevor Noah and a lot of Stephen Colbert, and Trevor Noah was, showing us, which has also been on, all the newspapers and all the channels, all the unprecedented food waste. Now we had a lot of food waste already in the continental United States, but now, we've had this food waste because of the restaurants and the schools being closed. That's just catastrophically large amounts of food being destroyed and milk being poured down, the drain, and people dying, for our meat, just to be able to eat animal flesh. People are dying. The meat industry is really at the center, I think, of this crisis, both in China and the United States. And then that there's still people who don't get enough calories a day in other parts of the world, and we're just destroying these like mountains of food. I think all of the things that you all taught us about with your idealism and with your naivete at that time, I think it's still the same. And I think it's interesting that today it's still the artists who, you know, the musicians that are really calling us to greater task. It's still the novelists and the poets and the kids. You know, this climate movement is being led by these teenagers, you know, all over the place. And I saw a picture today of a school that had reopened in another country, and all the kids were asked to make social distancing hats, and they all had these hats with these antennae coming out of it to prevent them from, you know, touching other people, and they were all decorated, all artistically, you know. But in a weird way, I feel like that buffer, you know, that we're putting around ourselves, around our personal hula hoop space, you know, our socially safe distances, is making me feel closer. You know, I feel like I can reach into this screen and hug you both and look at that peace sign scarf that I've already talked about, because it's the same thing. And I do feel like it's almost become catastrophic and apocalyptic in ways that, and you know, I mean, I'm sure you thought the Vietnam War was pretty apocalyptic, you know, like, I think you thought, you know, the nuclear arms race in the Cold War with Russia that you grew up with and that I grew up with in the 80s wasn't that apocalyptic and catastrophic enough. But, you know, we're in for it now, aren't we? I mean, and at the same time, I do feel like some portions of our world are going to come out of this thing with better priorities. Build a new garden, the common good over individualism, and hey, whatever, you know, stop the war. You know, I know I'm a broken record, but you know, they're talking about having these flyovers, these military flyovers, just to thank us for like going to the hospital. You know, like I think we need like you know, I think we need something else. I think we need a different metaphor for that. You know, I heard a really good sermon about the mask from a chaplain, and she basically said, by putting on my mask, I'm hiding my smile, but I'm letting my patients, you know, see Jesus by wearing that mask.
So I think one thing that's happening here is that we're having a real clash of cultures and institutions. So on one hand, we can say that our political institutions have failed us because they have not figured out how to take the abundance and surplus that we have and connect it with those who are starving. That can be done, but we haven't figured out how to do it on a large institutional level. But it could be done. But what we're seeing is ordinary people um, doing amazing things in terms of connecting food with people who are hungry. So I saw a little story on a woman here in Nashville who lives in public housing, and she puts together 50 bags of food 3 times a week. And people come to one of her windows in the side of her house, mainly children, and get their bag for the day. And she's financing that out of her own funds and out of asking that she's doing on social media, but she's figuring out how to do it. And that's just one example. There are millions of these kinds of examples going on. And so I think the task is going to be whether or not coming up from the grassroots and from the ground of these amazing instances that are going on, if that's going to be able to heal these larger political institutions that are not working and that have collapsed and that have failed. But that's my hope, is that
whether by necessity or by ingenuity, the old radicals called that mutual aid, and mutual aid seems to be coming up as the person to person, neighborhood to neighborhood, block to block. We saw that after the tornado, and because we both live in Middle Tennessee, we had a tornado, a massive tornado, a very destructive tornado, sandwiched up against the global pandemic. But I have seen mutual aid arise, and I've seen mental health care doing amazing things. I've seen self-care. You know, I go to therapy and I work on my self-care, and I feel that, you know, the inner universe of people's spirituality, whether it be through prayer or a spiritual practice, or maybe yoga or exercise or art and music, because I know that we're fans of music and art being ways to connect with spirit. But I have seen kind of a lot of ingenuity, like you said, in neighborhood food mutual aid, and then also I think in terms of people's awareness about the importance of mental health and self-care. Well, we've done this almost for an hour, so let's wrap this up. If in case somebody from Cookeville or somebody from Tennessee Tech watches this, or somebody from the Wesley Foundation, what's one last thing to bring it full circle? We started talking about you all being temporary residents of Cookeville in the 60s, and the work that you all did on our campus and at the Wesley Foundation. What is maybe one last little, how can we close this up? I want to let you all have the benediction or the last word here. It doesn't have to be about tech, but bring it home, as they like to say. We've been jamming for an hour, Calvin. We keep playing the chorus over and over again. You got to take us out. Take us out, you two.
So, a very wise woman, Peggy Billings, who is an important mentor for us, came in the early days of our seminary time at Candler School of Theology. And it was in the really uprising days of the women's movement, and it was just beginning to filter into the church. And so at that time, there were no women on the faculty. There wasn't even a women's restroom in the main building of the seminary. So she came, and for those of us there at Candler, we thought, oh, we wish we were in New York. Everything's going on there. And, here we are stuck in this place that, is so backward. And what she said was, the real revolution is going on in places like this seminary. It's not New York, not Washington. The real seminary is going on in what we consider the backwaters of our world. So the real revolution is going to go on in Putnam County, Cookeville, Tennessee Tech, and the Wesley Foundation. And it's already started, and there are people who have visions. And my hope is that people live those visions out in those places.
If you've made it to the end of this video, you've spent an hour with Kimbrough, Reverend Calvin Kimbrough, and Reverend Nelia Kimbrough, proud graduates of Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville, proud retired pastors in the United Methodist tradition, part of the Tennessee Conference, and artists, multimedia artists, living their retirement in the wonderful neighborhood of Hillsborough Village in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm Andrew Smith, here in Cookeville, editor of Ordinary Space Zine, and DJ and author and poet and professor and preacher, and just kind of hanging out. But we came together today to remember the 4 young people who lost their lives on May 4th, 1970, and remember 50 years later that we're still saying give peace a chance, and we're saying common good as well as individual freedom. And we don't have to choose between the two. We can be free and do good. So thank you all for doing good for so many years, and thank you for spending this hour with me. We're going to say bye. Y'all can say goodbye, and I'll pause the video. I'll pause the video, but you all can hang on for just 1 minute. We'll say our goodbyes. But thanks again for tuning into our little YouTube today.